Welcome, everyone. I'm Marcia Marley, President and Executive Director of Succeed Together, the parent organization of the Literary Festival. We hope you enjoy tonight's authors, Mo Rocca and Jonathan Greenberg, discussing their book, Obituaries. Over the next 2 weeks, we have several more not to be missed festival events, so mark your calendars. On May 27th, the National Book Award winner and best-selling author Colin McCann will discuss his acclaimed book, A Paragon, followed by Madeline Miller talking about her latest novel, Circe, on June 3rd. That's May 27th and June 3rd. Both events start at 7 p.m. We will be continuing to add additional authors over the summer. Visit succeedtogether.org for a complete list of upcoming events. By buying tonight's tickets, you're not only supporting our literary festival, but also the transformative work of Succeed Together. With the advent of COVID-19, our mission of closing the opportunity gap, achievement gap, has become even more urgent, as so many more students are falling further and further behind. In response, Succeed Together has moved all our programs online, and we are now offering them free to all students. Moreover, as is the case for so many nonprofits, in order to sustain this life-changing work, we need funding during this crisis. Without additional funds, our critical summer program is in jeopardy. Please consider supporting S2G programs by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen. You can't miss it. It's the one in teal green. And thank you for your support. None of our events or programs would be possible without the generous sponsors, as well as our hardworking and talented volunteers and staff. It is my pleasure tonight to now introduce the person responsible for these literary events, festival director, and S2G program director, Jackie Moras. Jackie?
Thank you, Marcia. Hi, thank you for being here today. I've been reading Mobituaries, and I'm thrilled to have these two speakers here today to talk about it. Jonathan Greenberg is an Emmy Award-winning screenwriter and professor of English at Montclair State University. His television credits include the children's animated series Rugrats and Arthur. In addition to Mobituaries, he's the author of 2 books, Modernism, Satire, and the Novel, and the Cambridge Introduction to Satire. He's also a member of the Festival Advisory Committee and has been a great supporter of the festival and Succeed Together. John lives in Montclair with his wife and 2 kids, and he is also a good friend of mine. I'm also thrilled to introduce Mo Rocca. He is a correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, host of Henry Ford's Innovation Nation, and host and creator of the cooking channel My Grandmother's Ravioli, in which he learned to cook from grandmothers and grandfathers across the country. He's also a frequent panelist on NPR's hit weekly quiz show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Mo spent 4 seasons as a correspondent on Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Jackie, I just want to add to everyone out there that both my wife and both of my kids have volunteered at Succeed Together Tutoring. It's a marvelous organization. These are difficult times for nonprofits. They're even more difficult times for the people and the communities that those nonprofits serve. So remember Succeed Together. There's a green donation button. And we hope you enjoy the evening. We also hope that you remember Succeed Together. So good evening, everyone. Hi, Mo. It's so good to
John.
see you.
Good to see
We've
you.
talked a lot, but have not Zoomed or Skyped or talked face to face in a while. And I thought maybe we'd start off, and I would just ask you to tell people out there exactly what a mobituary is.
Well, I think a mobituary, as as it evolved and we developed them. Mobituary is an appreciation for someone or something that didn't get the send-off it deserved the first time around, or any send-off at all. And I think there are basically 4 categories that you can see in the book, and to an extent in the podcast as well. There are people who are still household names, like an Audrey Hepburn, who through some unfortunate circumstance, in her case, dying on the same day that Bill Clinton was inaugurated, kind of was overshadowed, right? What would have ordinarily been front page news was A24 or something. There are people that were once wildly famous, as we learned, like the conjoined so-called Siamese twins, Chang and Eng, some of the country's very first entertainers, first Asians in America, who were once household names, sort of fell off the map unless you had that Guinness Book of World Records that both you and I have with
Which
that
I
picture.
had.
Everyone
Right.
knows that picture. There were people that didn't get acknowledgement at all, even in their lifetime. And we call those forgotten forerunners, kind of the pioneers before the pioneers, like Moses Fleetwood Walker, who played what passed for pro ball 63 years, an African-American, 63 years before Jackie Robinson. And then there were there were people and things that never got any kind of send-off, like the 2 trees that were poisoned at Auburn University, or the station wagon. So they're those 4 buckets, as they say, I think.
Yeah. No, and I remember when you first pitched this idea to me, and it was actually that last category that set my imagination kind of really going, because I said, in a way, it's not just people that die. Like it's plants, it's cars, it's things, it's cultural movements, countries. So we've got there's Mobituary. I mean, the station wagon is one that I think everyone seems to be interested in. We all remember the station wagon. It's in our lifetime, and we all kind of mourn the station wagon a little bit. Are there any particular from that last category that you were glad we especially included?
Well, one I'm glad that you brought up. I had never heard the diagnosis, the 3-word diagnosis, Chuck Cunningham syndrome, until you mentioned it. So why don't you talk a little bit about Chuck Cunningham syndrome?
Right. So as everyone of our generation knows, probably except for Judy Bard, who was the one girl in my high school who did not own a TV, but everyone, you always had one. If Judy, if you're there, by now you know Chuck Cunningham. But Chuck Cunningham was the brother on the first season of Happy Days, the older brother who was always bouncing his basketball, eating a sandwich, and very laconic, didn't say much. He often responded just by, dribble. And then he kind of disappeared. And suddenly there were 2 Cunningham kids. And no one ever really commented. No one thought it was a big deal, and he was gone. So we kind of thought those fictional characters, as well as real life characters, they're doing some paving outside.
Montclair.
I'll see if it passes. We thought those fictional characters needed their Mobituaries too. So there's actually a whole section on various TV characters who have been written out or disappeared from your favorite shows, and especially sitcoms, right?
Yeah, it's funny that because in an hour-long drama, you can kill someone off, and it's part of the plot. It belongs as part of the plot, right? And in the very artificial world, fantasy world of a sitcom, it doesn't make sense to have a character die unless it's a very, very special episode. And, I think what we learned is somebody like Gary Marshall was kind of a genius, that overused word, but of knowing how far you could push an audience's suspension of disbelief. And he chose to just vaporize. Oh, okay. Just pay them a little money and they'll Anyway, but anyway, hey everyone. So, but Gary Marshall just said, we're just going to vaporize this character. He's going to go upstairs and he's never going to come down again. And in a funny twist, if you're really into Happy Days Arcana, there were two different actors who played Chuck Cunningham to make things even weirder. And talk about suspension of disbelief. It's like the case, of course, of the two Darrens.
Right, and then later for the Roseanne fans, the two Beckys.
Right.
Yeah, and the other great thing, and that we kind of came, and I think it was in your interview with Henry Winkler that this came out, that what they realized was that Fonzie, as his role in the series, as he kind of became the star of the series in Happy Days, took over sort of the structural role that that the older brother was going to have. I mean, Fonzie was essentially, Richie's older brother. So,
right. So, why would you go to anyone other than the Fonz for dating advice? And and we should, since we are broadcasting from New Jersey right now. Props to Alan Sepinwall, to TV critic Alan Sepinwall, who brought up the fact that, how harrowing it was when Joni and Chachi were married, that Mr. C toasted his two children. I mean, it really was like he was completely denying. Yeah. It was insulting.
It was kind of Orwellian. Like he was an unperson. He just ceased to ever have existed. Yeah, that was cold. Yeah.
One thing that I know was also really fun to do, and I hope you agree, were characters that, in a sense, the actor who played the character ended up eclipsing, kind of killing off the memory of the real person.
Right. So the great one here is Barbara Streisand and Fanny Brice.
Yeah, that's right. And we made that. And just so people understand the way the book is structured, there are sort of main essays. And then afterwards, they're what we call cemeteries or graveyards, where they're shorter examples that were kind of fun. And in this case, for this phenomenon of kind of an actor eclipsing the memory of the real person, Funny Girl seemed like the epitome of that. I don't think it's just me that when you watch a movie like Funny Girl, you sort of think you're watching the story of Barbara Streisand. You forget that it's a story of a historic figure, that she was playing Fanny Brice. But it seemed like you're watching the story about the emergence of this great star, because it was in fact Streisand's premiere. There were other. Did you have other favorite examples in that category?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of great ones. I mean, this was such a great story to write, because I learned so much about, not just about Fanny Brice, but sort of about the history of Jewish comedy in America, which is, my scholarly stuff I've written on satire. So this was sort of like an unexplored vein that was really exciting. And then the other thing that I kind of learned when you kind of took the essay and rewrote it was that this was secretly your vehicle to write about Barbara Streisand. Yes, and since you couldn't write about Barbara, not only is she alive, but also, as you say, she's immortal.
Yeah, she'll never die, and so she would never fit strictly into the premise of this book. And what would be the point of writing a book if it couldn't address my love of Barbara Streisand? Yeah.
Right. So, but Fanny kind of became sort of the way to also work in Barbara, and it kind of becomes a history of sort of Jews in American entertainment in sort of miniature, which is nice. It's one of my favorite essays in that.
Can we take a moment then to talk, since we're on this, about this kind of biblical metaphor that I feel like came up a few times, this kind of Moses Joshua thing, right? Where there was somebody who kind of started along the way, right? Fanny Brice is kind of the Moses figure and could only get so far, and because mainstream America wasn't ready for her, even after she had a nose job. And as Dorothy Parker said, that she cut off her nose to spite her race. And but then Barbara sort of completed that journey. But we found that, right, in Moses Fleetwood Walker in a sense.
Yeah. So in fact, sort of a lot of these sort of forgotten forerunners have this story of we have a person, we have Jackie Robinson, who is still an icon and still, movies. Everyone knows Jackie Robinson, and remembered as well, falsely remembered as the first African American in Major League Baseball. Which he wasn't. He did break the color line, but decades before was Moses Fleetwood Walker for the Toledo. Was it the Mud Hens then?
Blue Stockings. Mud Hens was Klinger's team.
Right. So more TV is infiltrated, but so that he was a pioneer. He got so far, and I think it was Cap Anson, the Hall of Famer Cap Anson, who kind of led the resistance to playing with an African American, and the color line got drawn, and then it was over 50 years before Jackie Robinson could again break the color line and do it all over again. So he became sort of the Joshua, but there had been sort of this unknown Moses who had gotten very far, and the promised land was visible.
And I love that. I love this idea that for a color line to be broken, it has to be drawn in the first place, right? And that came up with the Black Congressman of Reconstruction, which I loved. You said, no, that's not the name of a really cool funk band.
Right. And they did, like all those guys, they had the facial hair. I mean, they had the facial hair and they had the names. Like, I love Robert C. DeLarge and what was it, PBS Pinchback. These
Louisiana. And just so people understand, these were the all men, African American, some of whom had literally been slaves less than 10 years before, who were then walking the halls of the U.S. Congress as voting members of the House, in the Senate as well. And it's one of those. It was our way of telling the story of Reconstruction, really putting a human face on a subject that a lot of people think of as, Reconstruction. Are we going to have to? I thought, by blinking in history class, we missed this the first time, which was the case for most people. But it's such an important era, and I love that we got to work on this and to bring that to an audience. And that chapter, every chapter in the book is a different kind of death, and that we call death of representation. That there were over a dozen in the 1870s and early 80s of these African American men, more than half of whom had been slaves. And it's actually one of those stories, I think, I know this sounds weird because it ends, Reconstruction's a failure, but it's so important to acknowledge how much optimism and hope and how much success there was in it.
And so quickly, and also so quickly, right? I mean, the other thing is, I think Reconstruction now, just, it's Ta-Nehisi Coates' book and Henry Louis Gates, and it's starting to kind of find its way back into the high school curriculum and into our consciousness. But there's so much I certainly had never known it. And not only were there all these African Americans in Congress, but at every level, like state Supreme Court justices and school superintendents and sheriffs and postmasters, and like everything changed so fast. And then it all changed really quickly again after it was shut down. So go ahead.
No. Over 2,000 elected officials at the state level. And, one thing I also got from that story, and may sound Pollyannish, but I think it's important, and I want to know what you think, important not to sort of wag a finger at the past and make sure that we're humble, because history doesn't move in a straight line. But I thought part of what was so interesting were, and this is for the audience to understand, about 35% of the book was also covered in the podcast, but we made an effort in the book to make sure that the stuff in the book was value added, aside from the 60+% that wasn't in the podcast at all. But the Reconstruction chapter, that was also addressed in the podcast. And one of the interviewees, pointed out that there were white Supreme Court justices, senators and House members who did seem willing to accept these African-American elected representatives. We'll never know for sure, but there were editorials that scolded the white reps who were socially shunning the black reps. And it makes the failure of Reconstruction all the more heartbreaking because there was actually goodwill. There were people that were willing to say, okay, this thing is done, we're moving forward.
Right, and well, there was Roscoe Conklin, right, the senator from New York, who was it Hiram Revels who
Yes.
his co-senator from Mississippi wouldn't walk with him down the aisle of the Senate, so the senator from New York extended his arm and said, Roscoe Conklin of New York, and he did him sort of the courtesy of that ceremony. And yes, there were people who were open to change and wanted it to change. And that's, history is unpredictable.
Who was somebody that you ended up liking more than you thought you would?
That's an easy one. Yeah, the one who really surprised me is Lawrence Welk. When you suggested Lawrence Welk, I thought you were out of your mind. I was like, I said, maybe I'll get you a paragraph on Lawrence Welk, right? Because all I remembered were sort of like those kind of dead times when you really couldn't find anything on TV. And of course, we probably, like people watching, back in those, 3 networks and maybe like a handful of UHF things, and that was it. And so if you didn't want Wall Street Week, it was Lawrence Welk. And Lawrence Welk is mostly like the bubbles, and that was kind of it. So I really, Lawrence Welk, I was very skeptical, and that story fascinates me for a lot of reasons. I mean, I didn't even know that Lawrence Welk, the band leader turned TV band leader, and one of the most successful and longest running TV shows in history, was born in a Catholic German-speaking enclave in North Dakota, and didn't even really speak English until he was an adult. And yeah, like we joke, some people would say he never really spoke English. He became, at his death, he was, I think, after Bob Hope, he was the second wealthiest person in Hollywood, because of not only his show, which was in syndication, he owned musical publishing rights, he built kind of a real estate empire, a Lawrence Welk Village, and the trajectory of this man's career was really something. You liked him too, I know.
I liked him too. What I liked is there are these values that we associate with young rebels. I know who I am. I'm doing it my way. And these are values that we ascribe to young people. But Lawrence Welk, in his late 60s, for decades, having hosted a successful variety show for then ABC, the network didn't like his accent. They didn't like the focus that the show had on regionalisms. There was a whole episode devoted to the songs of North Dakota. They didn't like that he didn't have an edgy warm-up stand-up comic, but he had this connection, this direct connection with his audience, and he wasn't going to let those executives push him around. They finally canned him, and then he goes into syndication, and his audience gets bigger. And this is when he's in his late 60s. And right. I thought that was so inspiring. Like, this person, that he had a sacred bond with that audience, and nothing could come in between that. And he's a badass.
And and for all the late bloomers out there in the audience, Lawrence Welk, I think, he wasn't even on TV until he was nearly 50.
Right. That's right.
so he was a band leader, and I think he was a successful sort of regional band leader. But it wasn't till like 1955, somewhere in there, that he got on KTLA and then went national and became a star. And then he won Grammys. He won Grammys with his, like, whatever his genre of waltzes and polkas, when everyone else was listening to Ray Charles and the early Beatles, and he still found his audience. So he was ultimate counter programming.
Ultimate counter programming, and we called that episode that chapter. I'm such a TV person. We called that chapter "Death of a Square."
Yeah, right. Perfect. Yeah, and the other thing about that episode is, I think that chapter is how we both discovered the Rural Purge,
right?
Which I had never heard of. I didn't know, but you want to say a couple words about the Rural Purge?
The Rural Purge, which sounds either like something they made fun of on 30 Rock, or they had Rural Juror there.
Rural Juror.
Or it sounds like
urban fervor.
Or it sounds like some horror movie with, like, Sarah Michelle Gellar. I'm dating myself, but whoever, like, is her version now, like, the teens go crazy over. The Rural Purge, which I believe you stumbled across and brought to the attention of the podcast side, was it was called this at the time. It was when a man who just passed away, Fred Silverman, a hard-charging network executive, came to CBS and decided that the network needed to do away with all of its hit rural-themed programming. Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Petticoat Junction, Mayberry RFD. The network had done gangbusters all through the 60s, but it had come to be called the Country Broadcasting System. And Fred Silverman said, "We are done with this programming," some of which was a real reaction to the horror of the Kennedy assassination and Vietnam War, where people just, like, Petticoat Junction is literally about a spur of the railroad that goes nowhere. I mean, talk about walling yourself off from the world.
Shutting it all off, right.
Yeah, and he basically, as one actor said, he killed everything with a tree in it, even Lassie was put down. And while it was harsh, it ushered in the era of Norman Lear, thank goodness. So, for good times to live, Green Acres had to die.
Right. And, I have to say, like, some of those CBS shows, which I was a little younger, but, like, I remember my older sister was, like, Mary Tyler Moore and the Jeffersons and, like, all that. That was the next wave of great TV. So, yeah. So it was a loss, but it was a gain. And I guess that's true with a lot of these passings that we commemorate.
Let's talk a little bit about more. I'm liking these themes that don't have to do with the death necessarily of an actual person. We spent a lot of time, and this was my favorite part of the process, the hours and hours and hours we sat together just talking, and the note cards in and out, refining, winnowing, balancing. Like I love the idea of show mix and figuring out balance and surprise. And one of the themes that we set upon, which I think is quite catchy sounding, is reputation assassination, which I think in a where everyone's debating this, what's called cancel culture, it was really interesting to go back in time and really look at real cancelings like that were like.
Right. No, I know. And one thing I like about that's a chapter in the book that's sort of divided into 3 parts, actually. So the reputation assassination is a phenomenon where we've seen across history. And the 3 examples that we chose were the opera composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, who of course everyone's heard of, right? So who was one of the most popular, opera composer of the mid 19th century. Did I disappear?
You disappeared. I can hear you, and now you're back.
I'm back. Okay, and I guess someone doesn't like Meyerbeer. So Meyerbeer, his reputation was was killed by Wagner. We can tell that story. And then the next one is about 70 years later. The very popular British novelist Arnold Bennett, who was, the biggest name in British letters, maybe along with H.G. Wells. And then Virginia Woolf wrote a bad review, and boom, no one reads Arnold Bennett. Like, people are Benedict Arnold? No, Arnold Bennett. And then we talked for a while about what would be sort of a modern version, and we finally decided it's time to do The Death of Disco. And that, that's an assassination too. That's complicated because we discovered there are actually 2 gunmen in that assassination. And I don't know, should I tell that full story?
Absolutely. Say, yeah.
Yeah. So many people probably know about the disco demolition night that the Chicago White Sox. It was at Comiskey Park, right? And a radio sort of shock jock named Steve Dahl hosted, where rock fans threw their disco records onto the field and ended up basically rioting. And that's usually the story of when public turned against disco. But we also discovered that Ethel Merman had something to do with this. And what happened with Ethel Merman, people probably don't know, recorded her own disco album with like Cole Porter and, I don't know, Sondheim, but great classics she did to sort of the disco beat. And I think she might have had a little debt to get rid of, or just wanted desperately to still sell some records. And she did her disco album. And that also sort of represented, I think, a breaking point of public taste for disco.
And I found that one of the satisfying things I think about that triad. Boy, are you hearing feedback? Is it just me?
I'm a little bit.
Okay, maybe hopefully it'll stop. Okay, it stopped. I think there's a temptation in telling these stories of these assassinations, the first 2 of which were pretty definitive, right? Arnold Bennett and Meyerbeer. There's a temptation to say, not only were these people victims of a reputation assassination, but that their work is actually fantastic and amazing and on top of it. And it's not an either or thing. I mean, you were familiar with Arnold Bennett before I was. I didn't. This was news to me, and you felt strongly about writing that Arnold Bennett's work doesn't hold up. Virginia Woolf, it was a mercy killing. The work needs to be killed. And I felt that way with Meyerbeer. I mean, what Wagner writes this pamphlet, Jewishness in Music. It's horrifying. It is so anti-Semitic. And Meyerbeer had been kind to Wagner, had helped him produce his work, and had created grand opera. He has the creation of grand opera as a legacy, but the music doesn't hold up. I mean, it was the kind of thing where I kept asking Alexa to play, I don't want her to go off now, the 2 or 3 selections of Meyerbeer she knows, and it's not great music. And I'm glad that we pointed that out, that doesn't justify, certainly in the case of Wagner, what Wagner did. But these things are complicated, at least to the end.
Yeah. No, in fact, I still remember, I think in the 7th grade, going to a birthday party. I think it was Kathy Buckley's birthday party. And people pulled out the Saturday Night Fever LP, and we were playing Frisbee with it in the street. And it was a little shocking to me because it hadn't been that long ago that was just everything. And I have to say, so Meyerbeer may be goodbye. Arnold Bennett is not on my short list, is not on my nightstand. I kind of miss disco.
I do.
Sometimes I feel like I'll hear a little bit bit of Tavares, and I'll be like, maybe disco got a bad rap.
No, absolutely. And if you're in Bed Bath and Beyond and you hear Gloria Gaynor, it
Right.
has senior stuff. Of
Right.
course it does. But Ethel Merman, the Ethel Merman disco album isn't even like so bad it's good. It's just bad.
It's just bad.
It didn't have to be that terrible.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that it turned out that she herself hated disco, because you can tell that she didn't that she wasn't taking joy in it.
Right. No, she whatever reason, her bad business manager, or she needed a few extra shekels. Yeah.
And another triad we did with that sort of was celebrities who put their butts on the line.
Oh, yeah. Very good.
A topic that I've always sort of been into. I mean, we didn't want to make this an excuse, as tempting as it is, to kind of take knocks at celebrities who just sort of adopt causes, but rather we took the more positive approach of saying, here are celebrities and public figures who really took a risk. And we did Marlene Dietrich with really, like, almost, I mean, it's amazing, her commitment to fighting her former homeland during World War II, really spending more time, Billy Wilder said, on the Western Front than Eisenhower himself did. I mean, almost taunting the Nazis to capture her and make an example of her. Elizabeth Taylor with AIDS. But the third was one I knew nothing about that you introduced me to, which is
Lord Byron. And as you put in the essay, if you weren't an English major, you might vaguely know the name, but Lord Byron was one of the few great poets of the early 19th century in England, and he was definitely at the time the most famous, the most sensational, the most glamorous. He was incredibly wealthy. He was nobility. He was charismatic, like gifted from an early age, and he was also like lived this life of incredible scandal. So he was actually sent into, or he self-imposed exile from England because he had an affair with his half-sister. And the English were a little uptight, and that kind of pushed the envelope a little too far. And so he went off to the Mediterranean, and he hung out with the Shelleys and, just lived this glamorous life. But he was very much dedicated to the cause of revolution and independence. And towards the end of his life, he was still a young man. He was still in his 30s, but he took up the cause of Greek independence. And Greece was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And he sold his family estate in Scotland to raise money. He himself trained soldiers. He suffered, he actually got sick, and he ended up, I've lost Mo. But
no, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Okay. I'm seeing an icon. I don't know what others are seeing. I'm seeing.
Oh, that's okay. But we can hear, so you can keep, yeah.
Okay. So I'm seeing like if you ever go on YouTube and you don't see an actual video, you just see the LP cover. Oh, okay. Others can see Mo, so maybe this is my feed. All right. So Byron led his last years raising money and trying to train troops, train Greek rebels so that they could have their independence, because he believed in, those ideals, that same ideals behind the American Revolution. And so Byron seemed like a nice fit with Marlene Dietrich and Elizabeth Taylor, who also took real risks and efforts and expenditures they didn't have to. I mean, it would have been very easy for Elizabeth Taylor to sort of live out her golden years just sort of in Beverly Hills and Bel Air and go to lunches, and She didn't have to do everything she did.
Exactly. That's when she had become a real punchline, right? By the early 80s, and John Belushi, right, making fun of her with the drumsticks, and she didn't, absolutely. She had a lot of money. She could have just she could have just sort of settled down. You ever wonder if some of these change makers, and I say this with admiration, are a little bit nuts, because Marlene Dietrich, I mean, her daughter wrote a big book about her, like basically saying she was kind of nuts, and she was amazing. I mean, like this kind of like this fervor, this edge, this kind of layer that pushes them to do these things.
I think that's very true. I think a lot of people who whatever achieve things like that, they need a little extra drive and motivation that may not make them the easiest people to live with. They're always the best parents, the gentlest parents. Like, I think, Byron never saw his daughter.
Who's also in the book.
Who is also in the book.
Because she was.
Because she was the first computer programmer.
Ada Lovelace, right?
Ada Lovelace. And so this is one of these nice things that we discovered in the book, that the way these different lives sometimes intersected in, unexpected ways. You'd be, I'd be reading up on whatever, Thomas Paine, and then, it would lead me into, he's kind of a contemporary with Frederick the Great, like who, or so we saw a lot of sort of intersecting lines of history that almost came up by accident.
And in fact, I don't know if you remember this. I think we both read Craig Nelson, not Craig D. Nelson, not to be confused with Craig T. Nelson, the star of Coach, but Craig D. Nelson's book on Thomas Paine. And there was quite literally a single sentence parenthetical that mentioned that in 1735, Carl Linnaeus, the forefather of Linnaean taxonomy, went to what was then the city-state of Hamburg to see an exhibit of a seven-headed hydra that everyone in Europe was going crazy over, like a Picasso show at MoMA. Like, everyone had to go see this show. And he shows up there, he's a botanist, and he's looking at the seven-headed hydra, and he goes, this is a bunch of weasel skins sewn together with some, like, monkey guts or something stuffed inside. Snake skin, sorry, with
snake, right.
Yeah, with weasel jaws. I don't know where the guts come from. But just pretty much like that, the belief in multi-headed beasts, in dragons, disappeared. And so that's our first chapter, which was the death of the fantastic, which was the death of a belief in dragons. Right.
And there were a couple of those, right? So we had a couple stories. That one is sort of how Linnaeus represented a whole change in viewing the natural world, right? Like, in a way, he kind of realized the dragon was impossible because it didn't fit with the laws of nature, and that was, but the other one that's like that was the chapter on medieval science,
right?
Which we also talk about how certain beliefs, like back in whatever, the 1300s, astrology was perfectly logical. Like, it made perfect sense that, you wouldn't have your bloodlet until you checked your star chart. Like today, people just go and they have their bloodletting and they don't even look at their star chart. But that was a normal belief, and for centuries.
Well, and one of the things that I loved about our doing Death of Medieval Science, and it once again reminds us to be humble, is that the dates on it. I can't remember what our death date was, but our death date was 1928, I believe.
Yeah, I think I was 28.
Which was when penicillin is first discovered, because until then, bloodletting, which is still used in certain very specific cases, but bloodletting lasted until then. So it's not like, those quacks. Some of them were quacks.
No, we even learned that part of what might have hastened Byron's death at an early age bloodletting.
Yeah, the bloodletting connection here.
Yeah. So no, and the other, so there are a number of stories here that tell about the death of a certain belief or a certain practice, or even like a certain worldview. And it is humbling because 50 years from now, when someone's doing their own version of Mobituaries, like something that we are talking about that we think is the most perfectly natural and obvious thing will be regarded as some bizarre, superstition.
They better call it something else, though. They better not call it Mobituaries.
No, because we're going to be around, and there's copyright.
And to be clear, the book also includes Frankenberry. I mean, there's all sorts of
Yeah. Should we take? I see there are at least 10 questions in our queue.
Let's do questions.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see. Hello, Mo. Welcome to Montclair. How do you choose your subjects for your podcast and the book? What criteria are you looking for? Kahan Cooperman.
Kahani, who is so great. My old friend Kahani. My eternally young, but old as in time frame. So the podcast was done sort of concurrently. It began earlier, but then they overlapped. And I think really helped each other. But there were different criteria. And let me just do the podcast first. It turned out pretty quickly that 20th century figures worked much better for the podcast because they're sound. And the very first episode we did, which is also in the book with a different spin, was Von Meter, the once wildly famous impersonator of John F. Kennedy, who was a household name pretty much until November 22nd, 1963, when this was called Death of a Career, and that was not meant to be glib. He became a living reminder of this horrible day. He lived, I think, significantly for 40 more years, and he might as well have been in the desert. And that was because our amazing producer, Megan Marcus, on the podcast side, went into the CBS News archives and found a 90-minute tape, raw footage of Von Meter shortly before his death. This was now in giving an interview in 1998, where he basically told his life story and really what it was like to be treated as if you were dead when you were alive. There was one particularly harrowing detail where shortly after the assassination, he was walking down 2nd Avenue in New York, and a steel riveter came up to him and just put his hand on Von's shoulder to comfort him.
Yeah.
And that Von Meter was so angry because he essentially wanted to say, I'm not dead. This other guy died, but I'm still alive. And so it was very hard. There was really only one podcast episode, if I think about it. Well, 2 that were pre-20th century. And those were more challenging. And there were 3 actually, but it required a kind of creativity that was a fun challenge, but to make come alive. The book, right, John, there were all sorts of things that we could do and spanning the centuries.
Yeah, and we were able to, the ancient world, so in the category of forgotten forerunners, like Moses Fleetwood Walker, we had, who was the forerunner for Jackie Robinson, and we had Elizabeth Jennings, who integrated the New York cable car or trolley car system, who was the forerunner for Rosa Parks. But we also had Hadrian's Wall, which, we kind of soft pedal this, but Hadrian was the first major leader who staked his reputation on building a wall. And, history should remember him for that.
But also, to be clear, George R.R. Martin, right, acknowledges that wall.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was the inspiration for the wall in Game of Thrones. Yeah. So
this wall at the northern edge of Britannia. What was it? Yeah.
Right. Between Britannia and Caledonia or Scotland. And
Right. Which sounds so nice, but they were, I mean, total animals, the
I
Caledonians.
guess, I mean, nothing, I don't know if I mean, Byron was part, Scottish, and look at him. So.
And then there was also, we had a chance in Forgotten Forerunners also to do the forerunner to AA, to Alcoholics Anonymous.
Oh yeah. The Washingtonian movement.
And which was the first temperance movement that really treated people suffering from alcoholism sympathetically, right? And so those were things that you couldn't do in the podcast in a lively way, or you making use of CBS News's terrific archives or third-party sources. On
the other hand, there are certain subjects, like Sammy Davis Jr., is in the book and the podcast, but it's great to hear those like clips of performances on the podcast. And he was one of those figures, some of the overlapping figures. I think we felt readers and listeners would be disappointed. Like, you buy the book, you got to have Audrey Hepburn in the book as well. Like, people would just say, come on, you left out Audrey Hepburn. And Sammy Davis Jr. was like that too.
Sammy Davis Jr., one thing we did for the book that wasn't in the podcast is Sammy Davis Jr. helped inspire this whole phenomenon of died on the same day. Famous people that died on the same day. Right. So Sammy Davis Jr. died on the same day as Jim Henson. That's just way too much talent in one news cycle. Who were the others? I mean, obviously River Phoenix and the great Italian Fellini.
Yeah, Fellini, right. And we had the whole Shakespeare Cervantes thing where they died on the same date, but not on the same day.
Right, because of different calendars. Oh my God, and the second Darren and Kim Il-sung for the second Darren got to share that date with the genocidal founder of that.
I know. The question. Let's take another question. We're up to 15. I think we're going to have to leave some of these questions for another time. Okay. A couple questions here. This is a good one. Who would you most like to write a obituary for in the Trump administration?
So I have been asked, you can answer. I've been asked this a lot. All I'll say is the only thing, the first thing that springs to mind when asked just in general what I'd like to write a obituary on, because I'm a little bit superstitious also, is I'd like to write a obituary for that fluid you drink the night before a colonoscopy.
Right. Yeah, that's it'd be nice when that's looked on as some medieval ritual that we undergo, that we're, where you just walk through. I imagine you can just walk through like a little scanner, like at the airport, and they just tell you no polyps, you're good, you're done. That would be good.
I think the reason they tell you to drink all of it is because most people are don't play by the rules, and so I think you really are only supposed to drink half of it, but they tell you to drink all of it because they assume that people will cut corners. So I think you and I we're both completists. I think we both drink all of it, and the joke's on us.
Yeah, right. All those people are getting away with perfectly, good scopes by drinking maybe a quarter of it,
like a sip, like a cordial amount.
Right, and those of us who like dot the I's and cross the T's, we suffer.
I should drink it through a funnel, because if you drink it like that,
that's the way we used to do it on the Harvard rugby team. Yeah. All right.
Colonoscopy. All right.
Let's see. I'd love to know we talked about maybe one mobit that didn't make the final draft of the book that you have to silently mourn. So we have to give a obit for a mobit. One that wasn't ready. Is there anything we didn't write about? Maybe it will be in Obituaries.
Something that didn't make the cut, or
Yeah.
okay,
Or that we didn't do that you kind of missed, that you're sorry you didn't.
Well, I mean, we started on Nellie Bly, right? And I think that's certainly worthy of being in what I hope will be a sequel. I mean, she's
Tell people one line on Nellie Bly.
the trailblazing investigative reporter, the woman who moved to New York and then feigned mental illness so that she could get onto the women's asylum on Blackwell's Island, and then wrote for Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper 10 days in a madhouse that led
right.
Yeah, it led to one great thing, which was the reform of women's mental health, at least for the time. It also helped give Bellevue unfairly a bad reputation. Bellevue, which remains a great hospital from that time on, because Roosevelt Island was really not even theirs. It was sort of an outpost of theirs. That asylum there became known as kind of a loony bin. But I'm convinced that she is Amy Adams' Oscar waiting to happen. Because everybody keeps saying, oh, poor Amy Adams, she doesn't have an Oscar. If she would just listen to us and play Nellie Bly, she will win a goddamn Oscar. It's all she needs to do, and she's got it in the bag.
Yeah, and we even have some pages we drafted that she could probably start with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Maybe she knows.
So, well, listen, we're told we can go a little past 8. I see it's like 7:55. Let me see. Well, okay, this one's actually from my sister. Are you prepared to address Tiger's disappearance from the Brady Bunch? Of the disappearing sitcom characters? Let me see. Well, a thank you from Daniel Flynn for the Laura Branigan podcast.
Oh, thank you.
I never properly appreciated Laura Branigan before listening to your podcast. Someone wants to know, will the Mobituary podcast continue?
Well, we'll see. It's very, I hope so. It's a real joy to do. I know this is sort of a boring answer. It's very labor intensive. For anyone who's worked on a podcast, they'll understand that. So it's a time of CBS News, which produces it, is under a lot of strain as it is for all sorts of reasons, not just the pandemic. But I really hope so. It's been incredibly fulfilling. And I'll say about Laura Branigan, I think, John, I'm curious how you feel about this, but Charles Kuralt, the great founder of CBS Sunday Morning, once said, it's okay to like the person you're interviewing. And that's not to say give a softball interview to anyone. Certainly, you shouldn't like the war criminal you're sitting across from, but it is okay approaching somebody with love, especially somebody who is dead, is a way of getting at their story, I think, that in a way that's underappreciated. And I'd like to know what you think about the way we approached these subjects, what your feelings on that are.
Yeah. Well, I actually think this was an area in which we kind of balanced each other out a little bit, And one thing when people have asked me, well, what's it like writing a book with Mo? I said there are two ways in which I think. So I came to it. I've done screenwriting, so I've done a lot of collaboration. But like in recent years, most of my writing has been like academic, very research intensive, dense, and solo. And I think that background really kind of meshed with your journalism. Like it was almost like they kind of fit together like pieces of a puzzle that and I certainly gained like so much respect for the way that good journalism has to put a story together on deadline, because academics don't have deadlines. There's one deadline, you have tenure, and if you make that deadline, there's no other deadline. So that's one way. But the other way is I think that I definitely, someone asked in there, about my background writing about satire, and I sort of initially started this project kind of thinking of like, where's the satiric angle in each of these profiles? And I think one thing that you really emphasize through the process is that there should be a heart, for every story. And again, I think that balance of, you want to care, you don't want to be cynical, you don't want to be brutal. You want to find what there is to love, but you also you need to get your sharp little digs in when you can. I think that was also like a balance that we ended up working out pretty nicely.
I would agree, and I'm very happy about that.
Right. All right. Well, I see it's at 8. Should we can take one more question maybe? What do you think?
Yeah, let's take one more.
Okay.
While you're finding it, can I just quickly say that when in that the nice introductions of us at the beginning, and it's my cooking show was mentioned. I did an episode of My Grandmother's Ravioli with 2 fabulous grandmas, June and Sally in Montclair, both nurses. I think at this point former nurses. I don't know, but they're amazing. So if anyone knows June and Sally in Montclair, send them my love.
Okay. Let me see. So some of these questions. So someone is suggesting that you may be more fashion forward than I. And someone says, is the fact that John is wearing a jacket and Mo is not, does that mean there will eventually be a Mobituary for the jacket?
I mean, who knows? With this pandemic, anything could happen, I suppose. But no, I respect the fact that once again, this is balance at work here, and it's also that my New York City apartment has really bad air conditioning, and it's kind of warm in here. So
okay.
So thank you for holding up the official look there.
All right. Well, maybe as a last thing, because one thing that I've just been beginning to think about is this pandemic going to lead to any? Obviously, we've already lost like a number of people who will be missed and who have died from this dreadful disease, and Ellis Marsalis and John Prine and others. But are there cultural habits? Are there everyday things in our life? Will office space somehow wither away when the New York financial companies realize they can have everybody work from home? Any thoughts on what Mobituaries this pandemic might bring?
Well, I'll tell you one that I hope it doesn't bring, and it gives me. It's almost like in some cases I feel like I'm reading pre-obits. When I read an article, for instance, on the post office, and somehow I got a pang in the 3rd paragraph or so, I think it was an AP report, when it said the post office was the brainchild of Benjamin Franklin, and it had that little history graph that I always love, and that I love about obituaries in general, about beginnings. I'm more interested in beginnings than ends. But just the way that it was written, it gave me a shudder, because it felt like the first draft of what would be an obituary for the post office, which I would be very unhappy to read. So there's that. And I also think it's interesting how we're already feeling sentimental and nostalgic for things that we might have ordinarily complained about, like going grocery shopping, right?
Like what was that?
Like going grocery shopping.
Right.
I did a piece.
When are you going to hear "I Will Survive"?
Right, exactly. And I did a piece for Sunday Morning about the possible death of the handshake, and I must confess, I would be sad if the handshake went away. I won't be sad about office hugging going away. Sorry, I know that sounds really creepy, but I just think there's too much. I don't want the pressure, because it's like an arms race. Like once you start hugging people at work, where does it stop? And then if you don't hug them the next time, then they think that something wrong has happened.
Right.
So I'll be okay if that dies.
Yeah. Okay. So some maybe salutary losses and some pruning of the the tree of cultural habit. Yes.
And to be clear, it stops at hugging. I don't want to start rumors here.
So listen, so I think before we sign off, I don't want to embarrass you, but I want to say that this is a book I think you can read straight through or you can dip into. But if you're not going to read it straight through, and if you're going to dip into, you must read the final chapter, which is Mo's homage tribute to his late father, which I really had nothing to say about it except to kind of redraft and give some comments and praise. But absolutely beautiful and touching moment to end the book. And when I saw the final copy, I was so moved to see that.
Well,
So.
Thank you, John, and I love doing this with you. And I'll tell you, I don't know what you thought. Like when I saw you on the street in the West Village, and we hadn't seen each other in years. And I see, by the way, that John's two great co-authors, Oscar Alcantara and Jonathan Lisco, right, from the Hasty Pudding Show that he wrote at Harvard when they were sophomores and I was a freshman and I got to act in. I'd been a fan of his ever since. I ran into him on the street, into you on the street, and then we ended up having lunch at that place that I don't really like, Grey Dog. I mean, I don't want to try to say it.
I kind of like it though.
I always feel like at Grey Dog, it's like getting the last helicopter out of Saigon. Like you order and you rush to get the table, and like it's like
that won't happen anymore with social distancing. Yeah,
right. I guess it won't. But we had a great lunch, and I thought it would be a dream to work on this with you, and I'm so glad that it all worked out.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, we're gonna cue the techies and say goodnight, but thank you to Succeed Together and the Literary Festival and to everyone who showed up tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Really fun.
Thanks, Mo. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for this evening. It's been absolutely great. And we are very sad that we've had to end this right now. But I just wanted to thank you both for coming and to also thank all of our festival sponsors, our event partners, and our festival friends and volunteers, everybody who's helped us over the last few months to transform our festival into a festival at home. And also I wanted to thank, you can see our sponsors and our festival partners on the screen, I hope. And I also wanted to just remind you about our upcoming events, which you'll also see with Colin McCann on May 27th, Madeline Miller on June the 3rd, and then we have a free event about the book What is Colour on June the 10th. The ticketed events are online only tickets for $10. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for enjoying the talk as much as I did. I was laughing quite a lot behind the scenes. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much and good evening. Bye.